Empires rarely collapse in one moment. They unravel in steps you can recognize. Across centuries, different powers hit the same pressure points: money, logistics, and trust. This video explains a 7-stage collapse pattern seen in Spain, Britain, and the USSR. It is not a prophecy. It is a lens, a way to map warning signs before the break. Stage by stage, we will track what changes first, what changes last, and why. The key idea is simple. When costs rise faster than capacity, leaders reach for shortcuts. Those shortcuts buy time, but they also stack risks you cannot see in peacetime. So we start with the first shift: expansion turning into dependence on momentum. Watch for the moment growth stops being optional and becomes required to survive. Because once that happens, the system cannot slow down without pain. And pain is where politics, currency, and conflict begin to fuse together. Here are the 7 stages in plain terms with real-world examples as we go. Stage 1 is expansion. Trade routes widen, territory grows, influence spreads. Success creates confidence, and confidence attracts capital, allies, and talent. Stage 2 is acceleration. Commitments multiply faster than the system can manage. Military reach expands, bureaucracy thickens, and supply lines become lifelines. The empire can still win, but it must spend more to hold what it already has. At this point, leaders start treating the future like a funding source. They borrow, they pledge assets, or they push the currency harder than before. The public sees strength. Inside, the machine is getting heavier to move. Acceleration also changes incentives. Short-term fixes start beating long-term repair. Projects that look glorious on paper get priority over boring. Maintenance. Rivals learn the weak points. Choke the trade, raise the cost, delay the deliveries. Stage 2 ends when the empire needs constant motion just to avoid falling behind. Stage 3 is strain. The money problem stops being a budget issue and becomes a system issue. Debt grows, interest grows, and the government's promises outpace its revenue base. Imports feel essential, but paying for them becomes harder as confidence wobbles. Leaders try to signal stability with rigid rules. Fixed exchange rates, hard pegs, or gold logic. But rigid rules can turn a slowdown into a squeeze because they remove flexibility. Now the empire must choose: protect the currency or protect jobs and production. Often it tries to do both and ends up doing neither well. Strain shows up in small places first: shortages, rationing, and quiet defaults. The elite argues about policy. The public argues about fairness. And abroad, allies begin to negotiate harder because they sense leverage shifting. Stage 3 is when the empire still looks powerful, but its options start narrowing. If nothing changes, the next stage arrives as a visible loss the world can measure. Stage 4 is loss. Not always total defeat, but a turning point that reveals limits. It can be a military setback, a trade collapse, or a strategic retreat. What matters is the signal. The empire cannot enforce its old rules at old prices. Loss forces triage. Leaders prioritize core survival over global reach. That means cutting commitments, selling assets, or accepting worse terms. From partners, industry can hollow out here as capital flows to safer places and supply chains shift. Loss also reshapes narratives. Yesterday's pride becomes today's blame. Political coalitions fracture because someone must absorb the cost of adjustment. This is where protest and polarization tend to climb, even if the war or crisis continues. Stage 4 is the cliff edge. The system can still stabilize, but only with painful reforms. If reforms fail, the currency becomes the next battlefield. because money is the promise that holds everything else together. Stage 5 is the credibility break. The currency and the institutions lose trust. Sometimes it is a devaluation. Sometimes it is inflation. Sometimes it is a hard default. The mechanism varies, but the result is similar. Savings and contracts get rewritten. Foreign lenders demand stronger collateral, and domestic markets demand higher compensation. The government can print, tax, or cut. None of those choices are politically gentle. If it prints, prices rise. If it taxes, investment flees. If it cuts, unrest grows. So leaders often mix all three, and the public feels betrayal from every angle. Black markets thrive. Capital controls appear. People search for stores of value. Gold, dollars, or tangible goods start to look safer than official promises. Stage 5 is also when empires lose the ability to finance long projects cheaply. That means less innovation, less infrastructure, and more crisis management. And crisis management is expensive, which feeds the loop back into strain. Stage 6 is fracture. The social contract breaks into competing stories. Regions, classes, and institutions stop trusting each other's numbers and motives. Extremes gain ground because the center cannot deliver stability anymore. Elections become referendums on pain, not plans for the future. Internal security expands as leaders fear disorder more than rivals abroad. Meanwhile, rivals exploit the distraction, testing borders, pipelines, and alliances. In fracture, even good policies can fail because the public refuses to cooperate. The state becomes reactive, and reaction is easier to manipulate than strategy. At this stage, reform requires rare leadership and shared sacrifice. If that unity does not emerge, the system moves toward replacement. Replacement can be peaceful, like a negotiated settlement, or chaotic, like a breakup. Either way, the empire's old shape does not survive intact. Stage 7 is the new order. Power reorganizes around whoever can pay and supply reliably. Trade routes reroute. Reserve currencies shift. Alliances rewrite their terms. Former partners renegotiate access. Bases, markets, resources, and security guarantees. The old center becomes one player among many, rather than the rulemaker. This stage is not the end of life. It is the end of dominance. Some countries rebound by modernizing and specializing. Others stagnate for decades. The difference is whether institutions regain credibility and whether production recovers. A new order also creates new myths. Winners call it progress. Losers call it betrayal. But underneath, the logic is practical. Who can deliver energy, food, and security at scale? And who can finance it without breaking their own currency? Now we apply the model to three cases mentioned in the video: Spain, Britain, and the USSR. Not to force perfect matches, but to see how the stages rhyme across time. Case 1: Habsburg Spain in the 1600s, built on empire, silver inflows, and war. Spain's system accelerated as wars multiplied and administration grew costly. By the mid-1600s, strain showed up as repeated fiscal stress and hard choices. Revolts and external pressure signaled loss. Holding distant commitments became harder. When costs outran capacity, credibility weakened and bargaining power fell. The pattern here is not one event. It is the compounding of wars, debt, and logistics. Once suppliers and creditors doubt repayment, terms worsen and the squeeze tightens. Spain's influence did not vanish overnight, but the era of unquestioned dominance ended. What matters for the model is the sequence: acceleration, strain, loss, then credibility break. and the social fracture that follows as different groups argue about who should pay. Spain reminds us that conquest is easy to start and hard to stop once the bills arrive. Now jump forward, a modern finance era and a modern empire facing a money problem. Case 2. Britain in the early 20th century with a global empire and a strained balance sheet. After World War I, the question became how to defend status without breaking the economy. In 1925, Britain's return to the gold standard is often cited as a credibility signal. But rigid currency choices can amplify strain when wages, trade, and debts do not align. The empire still looked immense, yet competition and costs kept rising. The Great Depression and then World War II pushed acceleration into overdrive. During the war, survival required massive external supply and coordination. After the war, the old imperial model could not be financed as cheaply as before. That is the stage shift from rulemaker to rule-taker in a dollar-centered system. Britain remained a major country, but the terms of global leadership changed. In the model, Britain shows how currency choices and wartime logistics reshape power. Next, the Soviet Union, a different ideology, but familiar pressures of cost and credibility. Case 3, the USSR, a superpower built on heavy industry, security reach, and central planning. For decades, the Cold War drove acceleration, huge military spending and global commitments. That spending bought influence, but it also raised the system's baseline cost to survive. Strain appeared as stagnation, shortages, and the challenge of matching rivals' technology. Loss can be slow here, a widening gap between promises and lived reality. As credibility eroded, reforms faced resistance from the same system they aimed to save. Fracture intensified as republics and institutions pulled in different directions. By 1991, the state's old structure could not hold, and the Union dissolved. The USSR case shows stage 6 and 7. Vividly, fracture, then replacement and new order. Different causes, similar mechanics, costs, trust, and the ability to supply stability. None of this means every country repeats the exact path on a schedule, but the warning signs are consistent enough to study without panic. So what does this pattern teach without turning history into a slogan? First, watch the gap between commitments and productive capacity, not the speeches. Second, track whether stability depends on constant borrowing or constant expansion. Third, pay attention to supply chains because logistics is power when systems are stressed. Fourth, listen for the moment leaders stop talking about growth and start talking about control. Fifth, if credibility breaks, everything gets renegotiated, from wages to alliances. And finally, collapse is rarely one crash. It is a series of decisions made under pressure. The 7 stages are a map of those decisions, not a guarantee of any outcome. Use the map to ask better questions. What is accelerating, what is straining, and what is being denied? Because denial is the quiet bridge between strain and loss. In the next episode, we will compare this pattern to modern debt cycles without the hype. For now, remember the core lesson. Power lasts when trust and supply last together. And when either one fails, history moves faster than anyone expects.
For now, remember the core lesson. Power lasts when trust and supply last together. And when either one fails, history moves faster than anyone expects.